to British education. Her ability to recognise each pupil's unique needs and capabilities inspired generations to resist the limits placed on them by post-war British society in its rigid class structure. And I think for me, Black Teacher is something that I find sometimes very humorous, sometimes very poignant, but always something that I find inspiring, as Beryl struggles against those who sought to diminish her through the lens of racism and to determine what her future was going to be. She was a woman who dismantled obstacles to ensure the success of her pupils, gain the respect of her peers, and find her place in history. This picture is a picture of her at Beckford, about 2 years after she'd become head teacher. In this picture, this was taken in 2000. It was taken about 6 months actually before Beryl Gilroy died, and it shows her receiving her honorary fellowship from the Institute of Education. Last year, there were calls to rename schools bearing the names of slave owners, and that resulted in a petition to name Beckford Primary School in Beryl's honour. Her clothes are held in the permanent collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum and her literary archive at the British Library. And she inspired hundreds of children to become lifelong learners. Her writing is an exceptional document of Black British history from a woman's perspective. And like so many of her male contemporaries, we should honour her many achievements. And I just wanted to finish with this quote from Benjamin Zephaniah about Black Teacher. And he says, "A must read. In Black Teacher, we see the real life of a pioneer. Her life makes you laugh. Her life makes you cry. Beryl Gilroy's strength and intelligence is inspirational. She paved the way for so many of us. Get to know her." And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And that's the end of my presentation.
All right, you got a few questions already and lots and lots of comments.
Right, how do I? Yeah, there we go. I've stopped sharing my screen. Thank you.
So one question that's come up is from, I think her name was Joanna, and she said she was studying, I think, at the IOE, Institute of Education, and she was saying there should be a module about Beryl Gilroy, so she should be taught in the classroom. And then other people were saying they have been teaching for 10 years and never heard of Beryl Gilroy until today's session. Any comments on those comments?
Well, I think she's been rediscovered by a new generation. She's being rediscovered, and I think we can't minimize the effect of her gender. I think a lot of her male contemporaries, you know, Braithwaite and the like, are names that we're familiar with. There are things that have been put into the curriculum, but I think Black women writers are a rarity. And, you know, she I think struggled to be published at the time. But I think that she's being discovered by a new generation of women. And I think it's very important that her writing is out there. So I'm delighted by those comments.
Yeah,
I completely agree.
Someone had said that they were on a PGCE training course and they're going to make sure that her name is included going forward. And then another person said they were doing a PhD in, hold on a second, what's it called? A PhD on anti-racism and decoloniality in school. geography with IE to start in 2 weeks. So I think they're saying they're going to refer to or reference them when they do their PhD project.
I think this is all sort of music to my ears. I think it's great that there is this sort of level of interest. And I think one of the things that I would say is that it took about 2 years to get this book republished. And I was very determined that it would be published in 2021 to mark the 20th anniversary of her death. I think at the time when she died, I kept her literary archive, I kept all her manuscripts, but for a long time, I just couldn't look at them. Mm. And I think over the period of that time, particularly in the last 5 years, there's suddenly been a huge amount of interest in her work and her writing. And I think that I'm hopeful that more of the books will be republished. I think Black Teacher was a first step. I think it's still a book that's really relevant. I think she writes a lot about her kind of emotions, and I think it's an unusual book. Actually, it's a very unusual book, and it's unusually constructed. If you knew my mother, you'd kind of completely understand why that book is constructed in the way that it is. But I think at the time when it was first published, people really struggled to understand it because it wasn't a conventional autobiography. You know, it didn't start with her childhood. It wasn't linear. And that's what people understood as an autobiography. It's now considered, I think, more under the framework of life writing. And it's definitely a memoir. It's a reflection.
Okay. Emily says, I'm curating an exhibition for Camden Black History Season at Swiss Cottage Gallery, I think she means. Darla Gilroy is one of the 9 individuals that will be profiled. So that's good news. And then Tom says, I work on the BA Education Studies and you can write to me if you like. I mentioned Beryl Gilroy on a historical module I teach, but I'm sure there is now scope to think more about how this material could be used more widely at the IOE.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And as I said, I think all of a sudden there's a whole new generation, particularly of young women, who are taking an interest in her writing. So yeah, that's great.
A few people are saying that there's still a glass ceiling or glass doors when it comes to Black female education.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I think we are at a moment of change, and I think we are still struggling as a society with a lot of issues around race and around gender. But I think that we are at a moment of change, and I think we always have to. My mother always instilled in me that you look at the future optimistically, that you learn from the past and you don't repeat the same mistakes, and you look optimistically at the future. And I think that's what we have to do. We know that there is still work to be done. And sometimes when I read Black Teacher and I reflect on my childhood, I reflect on my parents' relationship, and I reflect on lots of things, I'm very encouraged that things have changed, and I'm very discouraged that they haven't changed enough.
Sarah says, I'll add her to my BAESL6 module on gender, sexuality, and feminism in everyday lives when we do education. I love the book, ! And then someone was asking, where can we access a copy of Leaves in the Wind?
I think you can get Leaves in the Wind. I think People Tree Press is still publishing that, so you can get that online. Okay. Amazon.
Nina says, your mother is very inspirational. I'm glad to learn about her story. I wonder, how did she approach teaching you, her own kids, and support your journey throughout the rigid and often unfair system?
I didn't quite hear the end of that. I heard the bit about how did she approach teaching me. Was that?
The end was how did she approach teaching you her own and support your journey throughout the rigid and often unfair system?
I think she did 2 things. I think, first of all, she prepared me for the sort of racism I might encounter. And she did that by celebrating difference. And I think difference is still a word that we're quite uncomfortable with. So she gave me an unusual name because she knew that I would be noticed because I was the only child of colour in my class and in my school. So, you know, they could see me coming. And rather than making that problematic, she said, oh, you know, you are different. You are my daughter. You are unlike other children. You are different. And the spotlight is on you. And you must use that to your advantage. And I can remember once getting into trouble at school, and she said to me, I came home and told her about it, and she said, you mustn't, you know, mess about at school. You mustn't be naughty because they'll always know it's you. And I said, how will they always know it's me? And she said, they'll say the little brown one did it. And I was visibly different, but she made that something to celebrate. So I can always remember at school when they got to me in the register, they'd say, well, what sort of name is this? Is this a foreign name? Looking at me. And I'd say, no, actually, it's not. It's a very ancient English name. And they'd say, well, how do you pronounce it? I'd say, you say Darla. And if you can say Carla, you can actually say Darla too. So she gave me a whole sort of toolbox of things to use. And I think because she was a teacher and she had very unconventional attitudes to learning, which she definitely imparted to her own children. For example, I didn't really like going to school. I much preferred to be at home with her. You know, we were always doing things together. We were always making things. She came from this big extended family where they had kind of a sewing circle and they'd all be making things together. And that was something that she always did with me from a very young age. And so home was a great place to be. And I didn't always feel the same about school. And she'd say, well, you know, some children aren't meant to go to school. And I think you're one of those children. So maybe you should stay at home and use your time more effectively. And I've always been a real self-starter, really self-motivated, able to manage my own time, able to do a lot of things myself, to find a lot of, to use my creative thinking to problem solve. And I think a lot of that was driven by my upbringing and the things that she instilled in me.
Okay, Emily says, can you tell us a little more about her broadcasting role with the BBC?
She used to work for Women's Hour and the World Service. And over the years, she's done various bits for the BBC. And I think at one point, particularly after Black Teacher was first published, she was very interested in and got a lot of approaches to do television work. But I think because of the death of my father, I think she found that problematic, and she kind of stepped back from those sorts of roles. But she did continue to work and do bits of freelance work for the BBC.
Okay,
I've actually been trying to track down some of those things for the archive.
Wow. All right, Camille says, I'm referencing Beryl Gilroy in my PhD thesis on how Black educators navigate racism in schools. That's from Camille. And then Charmaine says, I didn't realize that Boy Sandwich, which I read at uni over 20 years ago, Beryl was a teacher, an inspiration and motivator to many teachers. Pleased to say, this is from Amanda, pleased to say Beryl Gilroy is being profiled at Bishop Grosseteste University's Black History Month. I don't know where Bishop Grosseteste University is, but it's being, Miss Gilroy is being featured there.
Well, I'd love to know where it is. Maybe you can send me the details.
We can ask the people in the chat. I'm sure they'll tell us in a minute. Audrey says, so glad Black Teacher has been republished. I drew on it in my PhD, The Education and Careers of Black Teachers at University of Birmingham in 1995. That's from Audrey. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it is so encouraging that there's this kind of level of interest in her work now. And it's very strange for me because I think about her on a daily basis. I'm often, things happen and I always think, well, what would Beryl say if she was here? If she was sitting on my shoulder now, what's the conversation she'd be having with me? And it seems like such a long time since we've been able to have a conversation. So I think I can reconnect with her through her writing, through sort of interest in her work, through people wanting to sort of talk about her. She always used to say, there's an East African proverb which says, when I call your name, you live. And she always used to say, when people are no longer with us, the best way to feel connected to them is to talk about them.
Emily says, did Beryl isolate herself when she wrote Black Teachers? Did she isolate herself when she wrote Black Teachers?
She always isolated herself when she was writing. From my earliest memories of being a very young child, I can remember my mother, as I said, she did a lot of things with me, but there would be a point in the afternoon where she would go off and write. And that was a pattern that was there throughout my entire life. I don't remember a time when she didn't do that. I don't remember a time when she wasn't sort of scribbling over a manuscript or at her typewriter. So she was always writing, but there was very definitely a sort of period of time where she protected that time and said to us, you know, I played with you, you know, we've done loads of things together, you had lots of attention from me, it's now my writing time. And writing is quite a solitary thing. Having said that, she taught me a very interesting lesson. She grew up in, as I said, a very big extended family, so she didn't like quiet. So when she was writing, she'd shut herself away, but you'd hear, you know, the radio and the TV, and the window would be open, and there'd be a lot of noise around her because that's what she was used to in her upbringing.
Lottie says, I teach at Middlesex University and have covered the book Black Teacher for the last 2 years in education studies, undergraduate modules. It is powerful to teach because it shocks some students, and the use of conversation in the book is so powerful in helping us reimagine the primary school classroom. And then Sandra Agard says, the book Black Teacher, Beryl Gilroy's archives will be used in the forthcoming schools program at the British Library. That's from Sandra. It says that Beryl Gilroy's archives will be at the British Library, or use the British Library, which is interesting. And then Sarah says, I'm a storyteller in the USA, and I'd love to include your mother in my telling of Hidden Figures presentation. These stories are about women who are hidden in world history, powerful inspirational women whose stories deserve to be told or heard. Sorry. Yeah, Black Teacher is available on Amazon and Audible, so you can actually listen to it if you wish to do so. Lots of thank yous, lots of compliments. Oh, Bishop Grosseteste is in Lincoln, in England, it seems. I've never heard that place, but it's in Lincoln, up north somewhere.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, I'm very interested to find out more about any subsequent events or activity around Beryl.
There's a slightly tongue-in-cheek question, or possibly the person doesn't know. The question is, did any other family members follow her footsteps into teaching? So do you want to respond to that?
Well, yes, quite a few of us actually. Obviously, my brother is Paul Gilroy. I avoided education for quite a long time. My mother said to me, don't go into teaching. Always remember, don't go into teaching. Do something else. So I had a long career in the fashion industry. And I always think one day I'd like to write a book about this myself. A lot of my relationship with my mother was driven by clothing. And I can remember very vividly points in my life what she was wearing, and we made clothes together from a very early point in my life. So it's not surprising that I went into the fashion industry, but I gradually got sucked into teaching, and I've been involved in education now for quite a long time. I've been at UAL, at the University of the Arts London, for 10 years. And I'm now at Central St Martin's as the associate dean there. My niece is now my brother's daughter is now working at Oxford University. She's teaching there. My nephew teaches at Bristol University, but my son wants to be an archaeologist, so maybe he's going to break the family mold.
Was the Nippers series ever available in schools and libraries? The Nippers series was available. It was?
Yeah.
Oh.
So the Nippers series of books, I mean, I get probably more emails about Nippers than anything else. I get loads and loads of emails from people who say, oh God, I read those books at school and I always remember the illustrations. The illustrations in those books for me are very powerful. You think that they're pretty much 50 years old, and they represent, you know, people of color in interesting and vibrant ways, you know, in positive, interesting, vibrant ways. So the illustrations are always very powerful to me, and I would love to get the Nippers reprinted. I would absolutely love to. They were used extensively as reading books throughout British schools.
Just of interest, I mean, how difficult was it for you to get Black Teacher republished? You said it took you 2 years. Why did it take such a long time?
Because the wheels of publishing grind mighty slow. I think it wasn't lack of interest. As I said, all of a sudden, after probably about 5 years ago, I suddenly started to get approaches, and people said, you know, who owns the rights to the book? You know, do you have any manuscripts? We're really interested in Black Teacher. So eventually, the world of publishing was not something that I was really familiar with. I didn't know a lot, and I think you need to know a lot about publishing if you're going to get things reprinted. So luckily we got representation through an agent, and then we had approaches from quite a few publishers, and I felt that Faber, and they have been amazing to work with, I have to tell you, they have been absolutely fantastic. They were just so passionate and so committed to the project, and it's such a young team. They were a great young team, and the whole team was committed to the success of this book. And as I said, it's been a great privilege to work with them, but it does take a long time to get these books reprinted. I included a lot of the images that I showed you today have been included in the new reprinted version of Black Teacher. And I thought, again, that was an important addition to the text.
Absolutely. If there is one quote from your mother that you would gladly share, which one would it be?
Oh, I think for me, it's the one about identity, where she talks about the being under the I'll find it for you in a minute. It was something about being under the flutter of the Union Jack. Because when I read that bit in Black Teacher, it always is very sort of vivid in my imagination. And she always used to say, I am a child of the empire. And I always imagine her from that quote on Empire Day singing, I vow to thee, my country. And I think what for me is always really interesting about that is that although she was brought up in this very British colonial system, they quite inadvertently gave her all the tools to be really subversive, to discover her own history, you know, to be quite vocal and influential in terms of multiculturalism. And I just, that bit in the book always makes me think about that, where she says, I realized afresh that I belonged in a cultural no man's land. However often I sung, I vow to thee, my country, on Empire Day in the pouring rain, I was not English. Brought up as we were under the faraway flutter of the Union Jack, I believe that at that time we West Indians did think of ourselves as English, but Englishness, I now realize, contains elements of history, culture, and perception to which I could lay no claim. So
Iram
that's my favorite quote.
Yeah, Iram says, how important is it for Black teachers to become more vocal about their experiences? What do you feel?
I think we all have to be vocal. We all have to be vocal. I work in education, and we are wrestling, as most universities are, with issues around equality, inclusion, and diversity. And I think for years, we have all kept quiet when we shouldn't. We have felt unable to speak. We've felt intimidated. We felt othered, you know, but the moment is now. So I think it's really important that we speak. Having said that, you know, in whichever environment you're in, as a person of color, you're not the kind of gatekeeper racial tolerance, you know, that's a thing that everybody owns.
Okay, got another question here from Alex. With the help of organizations like Black History Works, we're discovering excellence and diversity in the Windrush journey. Do you think this creates the opportunity of a specialist school like, say, Italia Conte, which could also be a safe landing for teachers like your mother?
Did you say specialist school? I didn't quite get the last bit of that.
Specialist schools like, say, Italia Conte, which could have been a safe landing for teachers like your mother.
I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a really difficult question. I don't know, and it slightly makes me feel uncomfortable to think about kind of specialist schools. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't got an answer to that one.
It's a more straightforward question here. How has Miss Gilroy been remembered in Guyana? Has her impact been celebrated there too?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the answer to that is not recently, but when we went to Guyana as children, she was like a sort of national hero. You know, we got to the airport and there were all these people there to meet my mother. And, you know, when you're a child, you kind of think, what's going on? You know, who are all these people and why are they making such a fuss about my mother? And she was interviewed on the radio there, and she'd written all the reading books that we used in the Caribbean in the early 60s. She wrote a series of books called the Green and Gold Readers when she was really at home, you know, being a parent. She wrote those books. And they were used all over the Caribbean as reading books. So the answer to that is not recently, but perhaps that's something that needs to happen, because I think she was always very proud of being Guyanese. She used to say, she even though she'd lived in Britain for so long, more years than she'd lived in her own country, she always used to say back home when she talked about Guyana.
I'm just remembering now, who published the book originally back in '76? Was it Bogle Louverture or was it New Beacon?
Oh, Bogle Louverture, they published it in 1998. I think it was originally published, I've got a feeling, by Longmans.
Oh.
But I think, you know, getting that book published then was quite an achievement, and I think she was forced to take a lot of things out of the book because they were considered too controversial for the times. So the kind of racism and the things that she encountered were quite toned down.
And was it the case that when Bogle reprinted, they put all that stuff back in? Is that what happened?
No. It remained toned down. I think in a way, I've always sort of felt that there's a more important story, and the more important story there is about her identity, how those things affected her, you know, how she felt about herself and her ethnicity, and how she came to terms with being a Black woman in a white space.
So you mean to say that when you read that book and you're shocked by the content, it's actually worse than what you can read there?
Can you say that again, Tony?
I'm just saying from what you said, that it was toned down. Is it the case that when you read it in its present version, you're reading a diluted version of what actually happened?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. We are reading the diluted version of what actually happened. And I think the kind of intensity, and I think the thing is, it is difficult for us to imagine these days, the sort of constant onslaught, the constant undermining, you know, the constant comments and things that people had to deal with at that point every single day, all day. And we have moved forward as a society in some respects.
Oh, you got some feedback in the chat about the first publication. So someone's saying that it's Castle & Co.
Oh, it's Castle, right, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. And then Bogle Louverture did it in 1994 from Terry. Terry and Lottie have jumped in with some information there. Castle & Company 76, and then, but who's Castle & Company? I never heard of those guys before.
Well, they were quite a well-known publisher, and I think she published a few things with them. But her original publisher was Longman. She published with them for years.
And can you clarify when it comes, because you mentioned that she was the first Black teacher in Camden. Does that mean was it first Black teacher or first Black head teacher? And who was the first Black head teacher in London? Because people always get.
She was the first Black head teacher in Camden and the first Black head teacher in London. I mean, female head teacher. The first Black head teacher in London was Yvonne Connolly, but they were separated by 3 months.
Right. Yeah. and Miss Connolly was in King's Cross, or was it Rings Cross? Somewhere in Camden, I think it was.
Yvonne Connolly, I think she was in Barnet. That was the borough that she was in, because she was head teacher of a school, I think, near Highgate, and she died fairly recently, actually. It's very sweet. She contacted me when there was the campaign to rename Beckford School after Darla Gilroy, which sadly was unsuccessful, but she sent me a very sweet note supporting the campaign.
Wow. All that collaboration.
Yeah, I think you know those sorts of moments. I think when you think about that achievement, becoming a Black head teacher in 1969, you know, it's over 50 years ago. That is a significant achievement, and I think that really does need to be marked and honoured in some way, because it's such a significant achievement.
Absolutely. Sondai says, would you consider republishing the original manuscript with that, which is unedited every soon?
Sadly, I don't have the original manuscript to Black Teacher. I've got a lot of other ones, which are now with the British Library, but I don't have that one. We've managed to track down a version of the manuscript that was reprinted in, you said 1994, I thought it was 1996, but there we go, which is in another archive. But I haven't got the original manuscript. I would absolutely love to have that, but I don't. When my mother died, I kept absolutely every single bit of paper that I found in her house, and I had, you know, 3 enormous trunks full of manuscripts, but Black Teacher was not amongst them.
Wow, so it's a mystery as to where the
it's a
original
mystery. And I spent many hours with the fantastic archivists from the British Library, sort of just sitting there going through all the stuff and reading bits out to each other. It was great.
You got a contribution from Korea. So someone's listening to this from South Korea, somebody called Una, and they say, what a fantastic, insightful session. It'll be great for students here to learn more about the struggles people of color face. I'll be teaching my students about Beryl Gilroy in the near future. Thank you.
Oh, that sounds great.
What about a reprint of Leaves in the Wind from Alexandria?
I think we are currently looking at the books that could be reprinted. I mean, I certainly would like to see Frangipani House reprinted. I would like to see Boy Sandwich reprinted. So sort of watch this space.
Actually, how have sales, or how has the reception been for the republished Black Teacher book?
It's been fantastic. And as I said, you know, it's 20 years since she died, and I can't believe it's 20 years. I remember the sort of last time I sat with her, and it doesn't feel like 20 years. So it's been great to have the book republished, and it's been fantastic to have so much interest in it, some great reviews. I get a lot of feedback from people, you know, contacting me about the book. It's been reprinted now in France as well. It's just been reprinted in France. So it's all systems go for Black Teacher.
Okay. Terry's got a question. Do we know anything about Beryl's books Stedman and Joanna, and historical fiction? Who were the subjects?
Well, Stedman and Joanna is another book that I'm also very interested in. And it's based on a true story about a love affair between Stedman and a Carib girl, Joanna. So that's also on the list of consideration of books that I would like to see back in print.
Okay. Have you had any feedback from Beryl's or Miss Gilroy's young students that are now adults?
Yes, in a word. I've had a lot of contact with ex-pupils. I think one of the interesting things for me, particularly when she died, they had her memorial service at the Institute of Education. It was quite formal, and all the great and the good of the university were there, but there were sort of kids with skateboards and you know, musicians, and this whole kind of gamut of very, very different, disparate people who'd all been her pupils. But I get a lot of contact from people that did go to Beckford, particularly when the campaign was on to rename the school. That was started by ex-pupils who felt that she should be honoured in that way. What I would really love to do is to find some of the pictures, some of the people from the pictures from the kind of 50s and 60s. Those people are much more difficult. I mean, I would really love, you know, the picture of her with the little boys. I've always wondered, you know, who those people were, and somebody must know. Somebody must look at that picture and think, oh, there's my granddad. You know, I just would love to find some of those people and really, you know, interrogate them about their earliest memories of being taught by a Black teacher. I mean, the other thing is that when she got her honorary fellowship in 2000, and she, as I said, she died about 6 months after that last picture was taken. When I went to the ceremony, there was a guy sitting behind me, and as she came onto the stage, he audibly gasped and he said, oh, there's my teacher. And he sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, that's Beryl Gilroy, you're not related to her in some way, are you? And I said, yes, that's my mother. And he said, I would love to meet her. And I looked at him and I said, you look very, very familiar to me. And he said, yes, I'm an actor. Everybody says that. You've seen me on television. So he came back with me after the ceremony to meet her. And as he walked into the room, he was transformed back into a 7-year-old boy. She recognized him instantly. I mean, this is a man in his probably mid-50s. She recognized him straight away. And she said, what are you doing here, in a very sort of headmistressy tone. And he started to tell her what he'd been doing. And he told me that as a student, he'd been very unhappy as a child, and that she'd taken so much time to sit with him and talk to him and find out what his interests were and encourage him to write. And she encouraged him to write plays. And then she got the other children to act the plays in the class. She used to make a little stage and they would act out the plays that he had written. And that had led him into acting and into the theatre and into production. And there are so many people who contact me with those stories. I mean, particularly when I was working in fashion, I used to have a shop on King's Road. And one night a woman came into the shop and she'd seen my name on the outside. And she said, are you related to, you know, Beryl Gilroy? And I said, yes. And she burst into tears. And she sat down and she said to me, my sister and I had a terrible home life. You know, your mother was really kind to me. And apparently she said that she persuaded this little girl's parents to let her take her and her sister home for the Christmas holidays. And she took them to the theatre. And she said, from that moment onwards, I decided that that was where my life was going to be. And it was all because of this woman who took me to the theatre when I was 7 years old and showed me great kindness and care and great humanity towards her. So I hear those stories a lot. People say, if it wasn't for your mother, I would never have done X or Y. I hear that all the time.
Okay. I've got a bit of feedback for you from James. This has been a totally inspiring session. Myself, my wife, daughter, and son are all teachers and have experienced racism microaggressions at various times in our lives. It's great to be having these conversations now and hearing about the challenges Beryl faced, and through perseverance and self-belief, she really did pave the way for so many. Wonderful to know her through you. Need to look at my budget and get buying her and Paul's book. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. And I think, as I always say, remember, she was an absolute heroine. She got what she deserved in the end. And that's something that I always replay in my own head. When I feel that there are obstacles in my own way, kind of think, what would Beryl have done? What would she have said? And she used to say, there's always a way around things. You can dig underneath them, you can go round them. Don't let people confine you and determine how successful you're going to be. That's something that you decide for yourself. And actually, that's been great advice for me.
And Hiram says, my gosh, Darla, I'm literally crying with respect to what you've said in the last 5 minutes or so. Now, someone else was talking about a plaque. I think it was Charmaine, and somebody else was saying there should be a plaque to her. So I can tell you something about that initiative, because as you may or may not know, Black History Arts works with New England to put plaques to Black people, famous Black people, on a regular basis. And we've got permission to do a plaque to Sarah Parker Raymond, after which the center is named. And that plaque will be happening hopefully in the next 2 months or so. So that one's going to be happening fairly shortly. And we are investigating the possibility of putting up a plaque to Miss Gilroy, but you just have to kind of stay tuned, because there's lots of negotiation that goes on behind the scenes. So just watch this space in the near future and see what happens. But it's been taken forward, that idea of having a plaque towards her, or for her, I should say. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, actually 10 minutes left. So any questions you want to ask, you better stick them in the chat before we wind up this conversation. Let's see, there's another little question here. It's just came from nowhere. Hold on a second, it disappeared now. Actually, sorry, Darla. What are you working on at the moment? So what do you have a next project on, and if so, what is it?
In terms of Beryl, well, I mean, one of the things that I've had lots of approaches about this, but I definitely think that a film about her would be great. I think Black Teacher again would make a great film. But so, I think definitely something in film about her life is the direction of travel that I would like to go in. So we'll see.
Okay. Yeah, film would be fabulous. It's coming from the chat from Amanda. The title sounds like a film already. Excellent idea about the film. Oh, James says, I'll see where we can get a room named after her at our professional development center. That sounds exciting.
Ooh,
I don't know where James works.
Wow.
That sounds cool.
Wow. Well, James, please keep in touch. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. And Quaker says something like To Serve With Love. Of course, that was a book made into a movie with Sidney Poitier back in the 60s. Yeah, you could make a movie about her, like, called Black Teacher. That'd be quite cool. All right, there was a bigger question that was up here and then it just disappeared. If I can find it. Oh yeah, here from Alex. Can you talk about your mother's ethnopsychotherapy? It sounds like PTSD. Also, how her works took 30 years to publish and whether this discipline is still ongoing.
Well, I think what she experienced was a level of kind of personal trauma herself. I think in terms of, having her identity attacked as a Black woman on a daily basis. I think she then suffered, the trauma of bereavement of the person that had most supported her in her life being taken away from her very suddenly. And she felt very strongly that in terms of counselling, it was really important that there was a match between the counsellor and those being counselled. And she wanted to really explore a space for counselling for Black women, essentially. So after she did her PhD, she set up her own private counselling practice, specialising in counselling Black women, and the sorts of issues that they were experiencing were things that she was very familiar with. In terms of whether that's still an ongoing practice, I don't know is the answer to that. And what was the second bit? There was something else about.
I think the question was about, is this discipline still ongoing? I think it was.
I don't know. I don't know. But I think that is something that she felt very strongly about. And of course, now the idea of kind of cross-cultural counselling is something that's very familiar to us. And I think, again, that just reflects in Beryl's life a whole sort of series of firsts in terms of her teaching, her counselling work, her writing.
What do you think your mum would say about the current initiative of decolonizing the curriculum in education?
Well, I think I'd refer you back to the Nippers. I think she, you know, that what she was doing there is what we would commonly understand as decolonizing the curriculum. She was not writing about white middle class children to an audience where that had a zero relevance. So yeah, I think she would be delighted to see the curriculum decolonized.
All right, at that point, Associate Dean Darla Gilroy, I have to say thank you very much for your time and for your fantastic stories about your mum. It's been great. And thanks to our audience for attending as well. We're going to wind up now, but as I said before, this has been recorded and we might have to do some editing, but check the Black History Awards website in about a week or so to see if it's up there. It should be up there for you, sure, all fingers crossed. But that's it for now. Thank you and goodbye.
And thank you very much for inviting me to do this talk.
No problem. See you again. Ciao.
Bye.